Thank you, really good to be with you. I've been kind of a president for a long time. I'm looking at Deb. I think it was 2007, maybe 2008. We hosted a conference with a bunch of folks here called Worlds Apart, Futures Together. Trying to think about how divided a place Fresno is, and yet how it is that really our futures, how do we come together? And those are some of the themes that I'm going to talk about today. By the way, I am not from the University of California, but the University of Southern California, which as I've been talking about recently, it's the scandal-plagued University of Southern California, which you've been following the news. Apparently there's no public relations crisis. We can't fuck up just a little bit more. So we're gonna do this as a bit of a tag team. So I'll speak for a while, and then Chris and I'll come in at the end and give a stirring and emotional conclusion. But I always like to let people know before I get started talking, one of the reasons for the mic, and while I'm talking, if my voice gets very soft or tires out or gets scratchy, you might think it's because I've been shouting at the network news and their poor coverage of the war in Gaza and political scene, etc. It's actually that I've got a speech condition that's called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around voice box, which is a neurological condition. If you've been following the news as well, this is the condition that Robert Kennedy Jr. has. He's the reason why his voice is so scratchy. If mine was not treated, I would sound like Robert Kennedy Jr. I would not be as delusional as Robert Kennedy Jr. But apparently I would sound like him. And the way it gets treated, this is true, is that once a month I get injected in my neck Botox, which is how we treat everything in Los Angeles. So totally works for us. So, we often forget what we've just been through. It's wonderful to be in a crowd. God bless you if you wanted to wear a mask. So wonderful that so many of us feel like we don't have to at this point. But it's easy to forget what turmoil we've been through. How it was that COVID ripped through so many communities, particularly in Inland California, immigrant communities, and how it was that COVID was the disease that revealed our illnesses as a society. It revealed the racial wealth gap, which meant that some people didn't have a cushion when work wasn't there. It revealed the inadequacies of healthcare and the disparities in healthcare. It revealed how many of our families had at least one undocumented family member and got frozen out from aid as a result, at least in the first round of the federal package. So it's a disease that revealed our illness as a society. It also revealed our need to depend on one another, our mutuality, but also the tremendous political divisions that emerged as a result from it. And all of this occurred in a context too, just as the COVID crisis was at its worst, the murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning, which came for just a little while and seems to have been forgotten. And there are two things about that I want to lift up as we move on. The first is that with the murder of George Floyd and the events of 2020, so many people began to understand the racist nature of policing. But perhaps more profoundly, began to understand that racist policing was the tip of a racist iceberg. That beneath that were disparities in education, disparities in economic outcomes, disparities even in environmental exposure. The second big thing I think that came as a result of that is sort of an understanding, given everything I just said, that the language that so many of us use, how do we recover, was the wrong language. Because why would you want to recover to a normal that didn't work. And then instead what we needed was reimagination and restructuring. And I'm going to talk about specifically what that means. And that led Chris and I to decide that we needed to write a book. So we actually did this during the first year of the pandemic. We wound up having to meet in places with masks and hang out writing, and do a lot of this by Zoom. And doing it in this moment, what we realized with this task that we were called to, both with this book and then also more generally, is that we need to do three things. One is to talk about racial equity and lift up anti-racism, but do it in a way that built commonality, that didn't lead to separation, but made us realize a common destiny. That we needed to craft a new economic story that would become common sense. We'll talk a little bit more about that, and we needed to collaborate for change. I'm going to say one thing about the book, and then I'm going to go through some data about Fresno setting the stage for what Chris will talk about. This thing about lifting up racial equity. This book has an unusual beginning. Most books begin in an academic conference with people talking to other academics. This book began out of a set of dialogues with activists in the state of California who said that they were tired of showing up with a laundry list of demands and not a sort of clear narrative about our economy. So when we wrote the book, we assembled a group of activists to comment on the draft. And we sent it out to them, and they gave us some comments. But we also took the first draft of the book and we sent it to our publisher. And the publisher wrote back, "We like this book, we're going to publish it, but for a book about economics, you guys are saying way too much about race and racism." And so we decided that in the next draft we would double down and say more. Because if we weren't making it clear why that was such an important part of making an economy that would work for everyone, and we weren't being clear enough about how racism and racial disparities, I was talking to these some women about this, are actually a handicap to our ability to be able to prosper. So it's not just a question of justice and inclusion, it's a question of how do we actually have a more prosperous economy. That if we weren't able to make that point clearly, we weren't doing well. So let me offer some sort of data background on Fresno and why in the Fresno metropolitan area these issues are so important. So first, everyone's talking about demographic change in the United States and the fact that by the year 2045, the US will become majority people of color. It is a shift that is coming that, of course, you can see in our politics fills some people with terror. They're thinking about America slipping away on them. That fills others of us with great joy and delight. For someone like me, in Los Angeles, which became majority people of color in 1988, all I can think is that the rest of the country will discover the joys of a Korean taco truck. And what could be wrong with that? What's interesting about this, if you look at the demographic change in the United States between 2000 and 2050, about 69% non-Hispanic white to a slight majority of people of color, 48% non-Hispanic white. That's basically the demographic change that California went through between 1980 and 2000. California was America fast forward. And if you remember those years, some of you are younger, some of you are closer to my age, not so young, you'll remember that the 90s were in particular decade of racial propositions. The Prop 187 seeking to strip away all sorts of services from undocumented Californians. The attacks on affirmative action and bilingual education, the over-incarceration of Black and brown youth, at a rate that was 50% higher than what was going on in the rest of the country. So there was a general hysteria around over-incarceration, and California did it on steroids. And all of that turmoil is what's going on in slow motion in the United States right now. So what's that look like in Fresno? Your demographic change. You will be about 75% Latino by the year 2060. You can see there's been a lot of demographic change, and it will continue going into the future. Now, one of the things that's interesting about that demographic change, interesting about almost all sorts of demographic change. People generally think the past predicts the future. And I want to suggest to you that there's some really important disjunctures, things that are shifting and are important. So when we look at demographic change in California, in this area, it's easy to think that what's driving it's immigration, because that's what it was in the past. In the 70s and 80s, California received 50% of all the immigrants coming into the United States. Los Angeles, where I live, fully 1/4 of all the immigrants coming into the United States in those 2 decades settled in LA. But, by the way, this just shows you what it looks like in terms of geography. But what's interesting is that California is no longer the big mecca for immigrants. So in 1990, about 1/3 of all the immigrants in the United States were in California. Now it's less than 1/4. Immigrants are moving to other states. They might stop here for a while, but they're moving to other states. Less immigrants are arriving in California. And you can see that looking at this chart, which shows you in the United States, the share of foreign-born is continuing to rise. In California, the share of foreign-born is actually kind of topping off and coming down. And in Fresno, the share of foreign-born is actually on the decline. Now, how can you have so many Latinos and not as many immigrants? Babies, right? Kids are being born here, and this just shows you the change in the youth population in California. It breaks it up in an interesting way, looking at the aughts, 2010, and then 2010 to 2022. You're going to notice something pretty interesting here. First, what's been happening with non-Hispanic whites. The non-Hispanic white youth population, these are people under the age of 18, has actually fell by 700,000 in the aughts and another 600,000 in the teens. That's a lot, right? That's, when you add that up, 1.3 or so, 1.2 million less young white people. Now, I always like to reassure people that does not mean that 1.2 million young white people died. We would have noticed that. There would have been a severe, shortage of demand for avocado toast, which is actually, my Latino kids love avocado toast too, because they're from Los Angeles and they're complete stereotypes. So, you can see the young black population has been falling as well. So it's not that, what's going on here is that there's less young white people moving into 0 and 1 than moving into 19 and 20, sort of graduating out of youth. So that's the decline in youth population. What's interesting is that there was a big increase in the Latino youth population, and actually in the teens, it's actually starting to slow down in California. By the way, not in Fresno, but in California. Why is that? One thing people don't realize, by the way, is this stuff interesting? Yes. Okay. So one thing people don't realize, California has the longest settled immigrants of any state. Meaning, if you ask how many years have people been here in the United States, it's the longest in California. In fact, about 82% of our immigrants have been here for longer than a decade. About 72% of undocumented immigrants have been in the United States for longer than a decade who live in California. The longer people are here, the more their family formation patterns get like US family formation patterns, having just 2 or 3 children, sort of barely reproducing yourself. By the way, I only recommend 2 because your children should not outnumber you. But I know that some of you have been less wise and have more. So our Latino population is actually having less kids. So what does that mean for Fresno County? Despite how this is being portrayed in the press, about 28% of your current population in the county is white, about 4% is black. There's a long-established black community, particularly in West Fresno. But look at the Latino immigrant versus Latino U.S. born. 41% of your population is Latino U.S. born. Only 14% is Latino immigrant. You've got, for the Asian population, it's about half U.S. born immigrant. That, by the way, is a very diverse population. As we know, you've got a Hmong population here, South Asian, Indian, etc., very diverse population. But the point is that it's a very settled population, and also that what's driving this is kids. And what's interesting is if we really think about demography, the thing people generally focus in on is the changing hue or color of the population. But what you really ought to be focusing in on is the changing age of the population. One of the things that's going on in California is that we're getting older. And the share of the population that's above the age of 65 is moving from about 11% in 1990 to about 25% in 2060. And one other thing about that that's super interesting. When people think about aging, we have in our mind, remember people think about the past, predict the future? We have in mind this idea that it's an older, whiter population because that's historically what it's been. But I have a secret for you. Every year, Latinos and Asians and Black people also get 1 year older. And if you look at the median age, I know someone just said darn, right? So I know that feeling. But if you look at the median age for white people in the state of California, it's flatlining for the next 40 years. Meaning that population is about as old as it's going to get. The Black population is going to get older. The Asian population is going to get older in a steeper line. The Latino population is going to get older in the steepest line. And what that means, this is something again that some of them that I was talking about and has been working on, is that if we continue to have populations that experience a lot of wealth gaps, but then become 65, become 70 and retire, and don't have sufficient support or sufficient cushion, that's a recipe for high costs and dependence in the future. So whatever inequities we have, and I'll get to them in a minute, we need to address them now to make sure that we don't have a burden in the future. Last couple things. Well, the population, share the California's population that is young, this is the share of population below the age of 5, is going to continue to decline in the state of California. Where that population will be located is very different. In LA, right to the right of those 2 blue bars, the share of the state's kids is falling and will continue to fall, largely because of housing prices forcing out young families. Where are the kids going to be? In the Central Valley and in the Inland Empire. So you are the future of the state of California. And another thing about this is that we have a lot of mixed status families, and in particular, This is looking at, again, Fresno, and this is, of all the kids in Fresno, 18% have at least one parent who's undocumented. So, big demographic issues going forward. The current situation is that you do currently have a pretty big age gap between your white population and the Latino population in particular. This shows you median age, half older, half younger. For whites in Fresno, it's about 45. For AAPI, 36. Black folks, 35. For Latinos, 28. 45, 28, if I have my math right, that's 17 years. That's a generation. And you have an older generation looking at a younger generation not seeing itself. What kind of work that you've been working on? How do you see yourself in the other? Because when you see yourself in the other, you make the investments for the future. And we are not going to address that disconnection unless we also address the questions of race and racism. So the other backdrop to this, and I'll jump through this pretty quickly, Chris, is widening inequality in the United States and widening inequality in Fresno. This is a chart showing you the share of income going to the top 1%. That's the blue line in the United States. That's been drifting steadily upward since 1980, the year of the arrival of President Reagan to the presidency, 1981. But you can see now that really the 1% has run away dramatically from the rest of us. Another way to take a look at that is below that 1%, sort of super rich, what's been happening to full-time year-round workers and their wages. The gray bars are the United States, the golden bars, appropriately enough, are California. And what this shows you is that the 90th percentile of the wage distribution, meaning 10% make more, 90% make less. You can see that in the United States, those at the 90th percentile, between 1980 and the current period, their wages went up by about 26%. California, 43%. 80th percentile, 20% make more, 8% make less. Also increases once you get to the middle. It's pretty much flatlining. And then when you get to the bottom, it's falling. And what you're going to notice is that there's widening inequality in the United States, but that is on steroids in California. When you move to Fresno, you'll note that even the top of your urban distribution has been doing well, and the bottom has been falling out. Those are blue lines. Why is that? This looks at Fresno median household income against Los Angeles, Orange County, Santa Clara County, and the Inland Empire. Santa Clara County, you can see it's the top end. That's where Silicon Valley is. You can see Fresno is the bottom line there. You may wonder why Fresno just starts in 1988. I assure you, I know that Fresno existed before 1988. It's just that the data wasn't collected separately for Fresno before 1988. But you can see that Fresno has a combination of problems, which is a low income level generally and significant disparities. And I want to jump over a couple of these to make sure to get to Chris. So this, of course, has a deep racial component too. We're going to look at California, and I'll say a word about Fresno and hand things over to Chris. This shows you the state of California, median household income by race. So median means half the people make more, half the people make less. And what you can see here is a very familiar story. For white households, median household income is $95,000. For black households, about $58,000. For Latino households, a little bit more. Statewide, AAPI households actually make more median than white households. I want to recall for you that this is the most diverse ethnic group. So within that, you've got South Asian, Indian, even within the South Asian Indian population, you've got engineers who are in Silicon Valley and store clerks in Inland, California. You've got Chinese entrepreneurs and you have Vietnamese nail salon workers. So there are disparities within the white population, disparities within the black population, disparities within the Latino population, but those disparities in the Asian population are very, very large. But this is a gap. We all know about it. What I want to show you now is what the gap looks like, same scale, same groups, for households raising children under the age of 5. Watch what happens. The gaps increase significantly. For white households raising kids, median household income, $125,000. Black and Latino households, half of that. So what it means is that our current system is baking inequality in to the future. And the question is, how do we get out of that? And having presented all of the problems and dismal conditions, let me turn things over to the bright-eyed, optimistic, and very hopeful Chris Benner.
Thank you, Manuel. And thank you all for coming out on a Saturday morning. It's a real pleasure to be back in Fresno. I was reflecting about on this presentation, which we've done together a number of times now. And it's a little ironic that we turn to me to talk about the economic solution. My training's in geography. Manuel is the one who's trained in economics. And the kind of person who becomes an economist is someone who's really good at data, but doesn't have an engaging enough personality to become an accountant. That's one of the many other areas that Manuel has overcome. So my training is actually as an economic geographer, which I think of as being economics as if people and place matter. So I'm not going to talk a lot about data, but I'm really going to talk a lot about how we think about and understand our economy and the potential for change in this moment coming out of the crisis of the pandemic, which revealed so many of the deeper crises that exist in our economy. And for inspiration for that moment, I turned to a really unusual place for progressive activists, organizers, academics, the conservative economist from the University of Chicago School, Milton Friedman, who wrote back in the 1960s in Capitalism and Freedom, only in a crisis, whether actual or perceived, produces real change. And when that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around, and that have been lying around for a long time, in some cases. And that, I believe, is our basic function, all of us, I think. To develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. So that was the 1960s, and Manuel mentioned when Reagan came into office in 1980 was a huge turning point in this country in terms of growing inequality, in terms of the rise of a neoliberal paradigm, a way of understanding our economy that's rooted in individualism, in competition, in the importance of markets and efficiency. But the groundwork for that change was actually laid going back to the 1960s, under the Kennedy administration, under the Johnson administration. And it was led in part by a whole bunch of consultants in the Brookings Institution and the Rand Corporation, working throughout the federal government and state and local governments, and beginning to help people in that moment think like an economist, a traditional economist, where efficiency came to replace equality as the primary driver of public policy. And that work in local communities and the Department of Housing and Urban Development and Education and other federal agencies changed people's paradigm, mind frame about how we understand our economy. And I point to that to talk about the importance of an economic frame. Because as someone that trained in economics or economic geography, we often are very materialist. Like, what are people's actual resources and that you can see and touch and feel, our houses, our jobs. But thinking shapes action. And what we see and understand in our world around us changes what we do and how we act. It shapes our institutions, it changes our culture. So they're very closely interconnected. And that's part of what we're trying to do in solidarity economics, is to help bring together the wisdom and experience of activists, organizers, people in their local communities who for 20 years have been building these ideas lying around in a way that this framework can help make the politically impossible become the politically inevitable. And so part of that is really trying to link the detailed research that we know and all the experience that comes from that research, but also with the simple framing that can become an alternative to the individualism, competitions, price mechanisms, and markets that drives the neoliberal agenda. What is the alternative vision? And there's really only 3 key points. You can go and read the whole book. We encourage you to do that. It's free to download on the website, solidarityeconomics.org, and you can get all the economic research and background on it. Or you can read the comic book. If you haven't gotten a comic book yet when you come in, pick it up on the way out. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But you can also just take these 3 points and see how that works in your work, in your environment. The first is, we should always talk about our economy. It's a simple reminder that economies don't exist in nature. They're not driven by laws of physics and chemistry. People create economies. They're driven by our laws and regulations and the values that are embedded in the institutions of our businesses and our communities. And markets, as important as they are with prices and competition, also have values embedded in them. Who has access to the markets, who's not, who's excluded, who's not. And so that just reminds us to pay attention to how our values and power are built into the very structures of our economy. And you can think about that like with housing markets, right? Because that's one of the most obvious of the ways that racial exclusion and redlining has enabled certain neighborhoods to be available for some people and others excluded. But here's the second point. Our economy is built as much on mutuality as it is on competition. Right? Think about Silicon Valley and the great driving tech industries that have moved California as the leading economy in the world and actually created the greatest wealth concentration ever in the history of humankind. Right? It's not Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk that's created that. It's a whole complex of universities and companies working together, and community colleges, and the technicians as much as the engineers, and honestly the baristas in the coffee shops that are really critical for the whole quality of life and competitiveness of the engineers that are there. The security guards and facilities as well. When you think about agriculture, right? the success of agriculture in the Central Valley depends fundamentally on, the fertility of the soil that has built up over thousands of years, the security of our water supplies, the health and productivity of thousands of farm workers in the fields, right? And we know from research that those places that invest in that mutuality and the commons and try and reduce inequality actually do better in traditional economic terms, growth, GDP, resilience against downturns, as well as in the social metrics. So our economy, mutuality matters. But why does our current economy produce so much inequality? Some people benefit from it. There are unequal power relationships in how markets are structured and who has access to that. And so we need to always be thinking about and talking about power in our economy. Who has access, who doesn't, and how do we shift that and switch that if we're going to be able to create the economy that we want. And that has a number of different dimensions to it. A lot of it is the civic engagement, conversations, building bridges across constituency, across race, across city, suburbs, across class. It's so important of weaving together a collaborative infrastructure. But sometimes it also requires protests in the streets, stopping the bad things going on while we're also trying to build another alternative. And sometimes those protests gets dismissed as not realistic or people that are, interfering with good processes. But for people who have that framework, I hope we can help them understand that protests are like the check engine light on our cars. There's something wrong, and let's figure out what's going wrong and try and fix it. So we need the warriors as much as we need the weavers as part of that. So our economy, mutuality matters, and we need to be investing in those movements for change that can shift those power relationships. So with that solidarity economics frame, what might we see and do differently? How does that way of thinking about our economy shift our actions in a day-to-day world? Well, one way is it might shift the way we think about a safety net and have us start talking more about the importance of a social good net. Just think about it, the notion of the safety net. These are images from the comic book. Catching people if they happen to fall in hard times. There's nothing wrong with that. But let's have holes in them. And that does nothing to address the systemic and systematic marginalization and exclusion of people. And it does not recognize the contribution that everyone makes to our economy, whether it's paid work or not. Care for children in the home, care for our communities, or the care for our collective commons of soil, water, and air, right? And that's something that everyone should benefit from and have at least a minimum guaranteed quality of life, a dividend from the collective wealth that's produced. So from social safety net to social dividend, one thing you might see a little differently. Many of us look at things like workforce development, helping people in difficult economic circumstances get better job training, to get a better job. Huge amount of investment in that. But with the solidarity economics framework, we might recognize that workforce development starts from a deficit framework, right? It focuses on there's something missing, a deficit from job seekers. And when we talk about a workforce development system, right, it suggests that there's actually a system out there, rather than a desperately underfunded, fragmented set of dozens of programs through different state and federal administrations that's very difficult to navigate for anyone trying to get financial assistance. It has a very paternalistic approach to who's worthy enough, who's eligible, who has the conditions to be able to get access to funding through that. And so what we need to actually do is start talking about workforce systems development, not workforce development, right? And point to the fact that that graph there, which is probably impossible to read, that's brought to you by the American Optometrists Association. I think you'll read it, you might need some glasses. That's the percentage of total economic output spent on adult education for all the advanced countries in the world. And the US is that little tiny record on the far left side. We spend 1/10 as much of our economic output on adult education as most of the advanced countries in Europe, right? So we need to be a tenfold increase in our community college spending and access to job training and build that system. And part of that, building that system, of course, is working with the community organizations who recognize the assets in communities that are often seen as deficits in a workforce development framework. The motivation, the skills, the experience that's not visible in a certificate, but shows up in the workplace. What else might we see? Well, we might shift our priorities from the tech motto of move fast and break things, like our democracy for one, and like our economy for another, and start paying more attention to a caring economy. So that orange line there is the total employment in the state of California in caring jobs, child care, elder care. And the blue line there is the total number of jobs in the tech industry. Right? So there are 2 to 3 times as many people employed in caring occupations in the tech industry. Right? But if we're going to pay attention to a caring economy, we also need to challenge, right? This is part of the power notion, what counts as skilled labor. Right? And it's actually much easier to train someone to code than it is to figure out how to motivate a 3 and a 4-year-old for a lifetime of learning, right? Or to care for an elderly person who needs assistance with bodily functions with dignity and respect. That's hard work. And those of us who are getting old, right? Manuel said that the median age of the white population isn't changing. I'd love if I could just stay the median age forever, right? But yeah, we all age. And so we need to really recognize as the aging population grows that skilled work needs to be rewarded and recognized in that way. The pandemic really highlighted this issue that our health system is focused on treating illness. And it doesn't do it very well. And we've underinvested for decades in public health. Right? We didn't have the education infrastructure to help people understand the importance of masking and keeping other people safe and getting vaccines when they're available. Right? We just didn't have that infrastructure in place. And so with the solidarity economics framing, we can start paying more attention to the social and economic determinants of health and promoting health and investing in our public health system rather than just treating illness. And recognize that that's a tremendous cost on our economy. I want to point to a couple of tools out there. As Dylan was saying in the introduction, our hope with these Empowerment Institute sessions and some of the work we've been doing is to help connect people to the fact that there is this movement of people all over the state and all over the country who are trying to keep those good ideas going about mutuality and connection to a point where we can actually transform our economy on a scale that we need to. And so we're doing work in the Monterey Bay area in Santa Cruz, again, helping to translate this notion of solidarity economics into different work. And one of those is housing, of course, the housing crisis. And part of that is pointing out that our economy suffers when we don't have enough affordable housing, right? Because people can't move into places of opportunity, and if they can, they're spending inordinate amounts of money on rent. and home ownership that could be spent in other more productive ways, because that's money ending up in the hands of unproductive real estate assets. And it's pointing out how important housing is to our economy, and recognizing that the status quo, which has tremendous racial disparities, I'm going to skip over this a little quick to get to Manuel's stirring and inspirational conclusion, but that didn't emerge by chance, right? We have these long histories of discrimination in housing that includes the redlining and these kinds of deeds on our houses that specifically prohibited people of color from owning houses in a particular neighborhood that exists on those housing deeds up to the 1990s. And so we're still living the historical legacy of that as well. But in each of these areas, and really this is part of the notion of solidarity economics, is like, what is our North Star? When we're doing our day-to-day work and trying to get stuff, like, how do we know we're going in the right direction? And what is that direction, right? And trying to articulate that in each of these areas. So in housing, we think there should be opportunity housing for all. And opportunity means both affordable and close to economic opportunities, right? Good jobs, safe neighborhoods. And this will require substantially expanding social housing, housing that is permanently insulated from market pressures, because markets don't work very well in housing in particular, where there's a fixed supply of land, right? Supply and demand, requires that if the price goes up, more people come in to produce the good to meet that increased demand. But we only have so much land. So markets don't work very well. So helping to articulate that and then point to the organizations that are working in a whole variety of different areas around producing new affordable housing, protecting existing renters, and affordable housing units, and trying to advocate for new policies. And we're doing that work first in housing, also doing it in public health, moving soon into childcare and pointing out the real importance of childcare for economic well-being. We're also doing work through something called CEMI. It's the Community Economic Mobilization Initiative. That's really trying to provide technical assistance, capacity building, support for community organizations throughout the state. And you can go to cemiresources.org, where there's a series of videos, along with connections to related resources, that both talk about how solidarity economics is being used by community groups throughout the state in place-based development, in small business creation, in workforce systems development. So please go check that out at cemiresources.org. And I'll just say a couple things about what all this means, I think, for some of our strategies in economic development, and then turn to Manuel, I'm going to finish it up. We need to understand social infrastructure, the organizations that help bind people together and build and support that mutuality, and particularly help bring together people with different perspectives and different values. Right? Those organizations that can do that are critical infrastructure for our economy, and as important as roads and rails and broadband, etc. So investing in workshops like this, investing in community organizations, needs to be prioritized as much as that as well. And I really think we need to transform how we think about inclusion. There's a lot of talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion now. We don't need inclusion into dysfunctional organizations that are perpetuating inequality. We need to transform those organizations. And that requires really centering the voices of marginalized communities, marginalized populations, to help understand the perspectives that can help us transform those institutions to promote more equitable economies. And really designing those policies to be anti-racist and transformative, not just focused on inclusion. And with that, I'm going to turn it to Manuel and talk a little bit more about metrics and accountability and inspirationally conclude us all. Thank you.
So, a couple things, and there'll be just a few more slides and then audience participation. I really, when we speak, try to think about what we want people to take away. And I want to get back to those three central points and restate them and hope that they change your behavior going forward. First, stop saying the economy and always say our economy. When you say the economy, it sounds like a set of rules out there given by God, nature, or the market, not something we made up. And just using the phrase, when you think about it, economists for years have said, without evidence, that raising the minimum wage is bad for the economy. It's not bad for our economy, because our economy has minimum wage cousins and relatives and people whose work we appreciate. The second, and I think this is a mistake a lot of us who have progressive impulses make, is to talk about equity just as a justice issue rather than as a prosperity issue. Do you really believe that this level of over-incarceration, this level of underinvestment in Black and brown kids, this level of exclusion of undocumented Californians is actually good for our economy? No. So proudly wear your prosperity flag and not just your justice flag. And then finally, and we'll get to it, understand that in order for all of this to change, we're going to need to work together in movements. Now, what do those movements need to do? Those movements, I think, need to argue that equity needs to be baked in, not sprinkled on. It's not something we get to after we've done economic development. It's something that's at the forefront of it. And we need to have metrics that hold our businesses, our governments, our nonprofits accountable. We, for example, work with PolicyLink in Oakland and have the National Equity Atlas, which is how many of you have ever seen that? It's cool. We did it. It's got disaggregated data by race, nativity, gender, education level for 150 metropolitan regions of the United States, the largest 100 cities, all 50 states plus DC, and 400 counties. You could have done nearly my entire PowerPoint off the National Equity Atlas. In fact, and maybe you've used it, when you click on it, you can actually download PowerPoint on an indicator. So we need metrics of accountability. Second, and this is a point that Chris was making, is that we need to flip the script. And flipping the script means who holds, generates, and interprets data to be able to inform change. We've got colleagues here visiting from the UC Merced Labor and Community Center, but some of the work they do is actually also about flipping the script on data, on who has voice, on who gets the spotlight. The final thing that I think we'll end on and then open up is to understand, and I guess there's really two things. We know that famous quote that's attributed to Martin Luther King. He actually borrowed it from someone else. That the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But that kind of makes it sound like it bends all on its own. It doesn't. Someone needs to do the bending. And that's all of us. And then finally, when we're doing that bending, we need to understand that it's going to involve a little bit of bumping. Chris used a phrase we've really looked into is weavers and warriors. We often celebrate people who bring people together, and we think that's important. But sometimes that coming together necessarily involves a little bit of friction. The labor movement strikes and then negotiates. Community organizers look up issues of environmental justice and then come up with EV loan programs for the city of Irvine. If you think about collaboration, people often think about collaboration as people sitting around a table and discussing things in a very polite way. That's just hanging out with your friends. Collaboration is principles conflict. It's getting together with people that you might have conflicts with. Having some things you might agree on as principles, and having principles about how you will conflict in an honorable way to be able to come back to the table with them later. So we celebrate change, we celebrate conflict, we celebrate collaboration, and for more, go to this website. You can download the book for free. That's our act of solidarity with our readers. You can get these comic books, there's videos, and all sorts of other stuff. Thank you very much. And it's about the transition to a green economy, about the EV industry, and about all the lithium in Imperial County. And I think the important thing to realize is the following. People look, for example, at Elon Musk, who seems to be a terrible human being, but we say, like, what an amazing inventor, right? The Tesla, et cetera, et cetera. Why does the EV market exist? Because of public policy mandating electric vehicles. And environmental justice movements that have made this a central demand to make that transition. So for the first 12 years of Tesla's operations, their biggest source of revenue was credits that you all pay for producing electric vehicles. And, that market would not exist without public will. So where's your return? And I think that's the script we need to flip, is to understand this gets, deeply at what Chris was talking about earlier about even the Silicon Valley. You imagine Steve Jobs and what a brilliant person he was. And he was pretty smart. And you forget that 50% of the patents in this thing came from the federal government and your investments. Where's your return? So we have a narrative around private wealth instead of thinking about the public wealth we create through our will and our policies. And that to me is what's missing. Because if we put that in the debate, I'm sorry, what is your first name? Google? If you put that into the debate, then naturally it follows that we've got to educate our youth to be able to get those jobs, or that the farm workers who struggled to bring our crops shouldn't be displaced, can find a route to fixing the machine.
And I'll just say one other thing about the robot issue, which is the principle of design with rather than design for. Farm workers in the field have tremendous knowledge and experience about the conditions of work, and how do we learn from that knowledge in ways that can help design machinery that is labor enhancing and improving the health conditions of workers rather than replacing workers. And one example we've been looking at in the Salinas Valley, the whole question of drones and pesticides, which often helicopters are planes. And people are starting to look at, well, okay, if you do it with drones, it can be a lot more targeted and protected and less pesticides in the area. And those drones can be operated by farm workers in the field in much more effective ways than remote engineers. Sir, right here.
But for about 30 years, I lived in the city of Puebla, which is pretty by saying uphold, but it's a very unique city. Because of that isolation, the community has become fairly cohesive. And I'm talking about the Hispanic community. And the white community is also pretty cohesive in their own way. But it's also a very conservative community. But what has happened is some really unique things there over the years. One of those things is a little credit union that was called the Little Credit Union, which is one of those credit unions that developed in 1966 out of a bill that was sponsored by Ted Kennedy and Joe Biden, two young senators. And what they did is they fused the partnership between the war on poverty and credit unions. So they started hundreds of credit unions all over this country because of 1952. And then with worker days, if you long you find a common sphere of influence, which pulls people together, and they can generate collective wealth. Right? So then they started one in Portugal, and it was farm workers and immigrants who put cash checks in place. So someone said, Manuel, start your own credit union. And they said, can we do that? Yeah, they did. And they operated that credit union on their own for about 10 years. They tried to get about $3.5 million in wealth. And as all these other little credit unions start falling apart, they started merging with, and bringing them into the membership. Well, I retired several years ago, and they asked me to be on the supervising audit committee, since I have a financial background. And I said, okay, so I became part of it. So, but I got to see the unique nature of this operation. With the money that they brought together collectively, they started the Mexican businesses there. They gave enough seed money to develop the top businesses in so many different areas. They financed personal loans. They started savings accounts. They started bank accounts. As long as your books balanced, the regulators didn't care. Because the law says you have to assure the funds of your depositors. They have to safety and soundness, right? So the other thing they decided to do is, well, we're going to serve the undocumented. And they did. It was the only financial institution that served the undocumented. They had 25 members they served the undocumented. And they had carnivals. And this was a full service credit union. At the time that I was supervising the audit committee, they asked me to be part of it. And then they said, you become the director. So my God, I was retired. What the hell do I know about those types of numbers? Being in charge of financial institutions is very demanding in terms of so anyways, I did take it on, and I was able to travel across the country and see what was being done with collective wealth. Okay? Now, one of the things I mentioned to Pastor is that our credit union was hit. I raised the assets up from 3.5 to 10 million. Okay? And then we were the first CDFI in Central California and one of 4 in the whole state back in 2006. Okay, so then I traveled all over the United States. Some of the things I saw going on using collective wealth in the community was incredible. It just opened my eyes. In the 1960s and the 70s, power was numbers. They just wrote this line, let's go pay it. And the more numbers you had, the better, right? That's what it was about. Well, but what I learned through that whole experience is that you have numbers, but power is also collective wealth. And if you have the right mechanisms to correct that, you can create change, because I've seen it.
Great, thanks. One of the things we say in the book is that we think about 4 paths to change. We always try to limit everything to 3. I'm a lapsed Catholic, so everything comes in Trinity. But in this particular case, it was 4. And we think that solidarity economics in practice is 4 things. One is creating alternatives, community land trusts, co-ops, credit unions, etc. A second is enhancing worker power, to be able to bargain with employers for more of a share of what's being produced and put into the market. A third is government regulation of bad actors and providing guardrails. And then a fourth is supporting high road businesses. That is, when you've got businesses that are doing the right thing, how do you actually make sure that you drive consumers to them, that you make sure that those are the ones that might get public support, meaning from the government, etc. And there are businesses like that. I tell a story. Chris and I have been around each other so long, we know each other's stories. He pretends like they're amusing. But I'm lucky enough to have an endowed chair at USC. And so I asked, this is actually one that comes with quite a bit of money. And so I asked the guy who endowed it, how did you get so rich? And he said, well, I treated my customers right, I treated my workers right, I treated my suppliers right, and the business just worked out. And what's interesting is if you talk to actually successful business people and not Donald Trump, the story you get is that I tried to treat everyone right and the business was sustainable over time. And the companies that actually try to have a really short-term perspective and hurt their customers, wound their workers, shortchange their suppliers, they're not going to make it over the long haul. What's weird to me is we've created an economic system based on the theory of the short-term screwing rather than the long-term sustainability. So 4 strategies: co-ops, worker power, government intervention where it's necessary, and figuring out what are the businesses that we want to make sure we support as consumers and through public action. Let's pick up where I gotta pick you up because you're like our host and shit.
I just want to comment there, but I'll leave you to a completely different question. It is very important while we support high-road employers to understand that those companies always end up getting sold at some point, regardless of how wonderful the business owner or their son was, like Save Mart, and then they end up selling it to some investment firm a couple generations away, and those people didn't think they needed a union, didn't think they needed to organize because the owner treated them well, and then the new owners come in and absolutely take the entire assets out of the company and their employees. So we have to organize all of them regardless of how high-road they are, but I just wanted to tie that point in. The difficult question I want to pose, something that the UC Labor Center and the Central Labor Council have been kind of working on theoretically and moving into practice, is how to bridge the gap in relationships between the two movements, labor and EJ. And EJ is kind of a large term, as labor would be, but the transition from oil in Kern County is not really happening, the just transition, and I was interested in how you talked about the lithium batteries. How do you think we can, quicker than not, get folks in labor who generally did not plan to be union leaders, right? A lot of construction trade leaders didn't go to college to be a construction trade president, as you were. And then a lot of folks in EJ, they spent their entire life growing up, their education growing into this space on how to change the world. So we have these very different levels of perspective and this emergency in public health, but this absolutely drastic need for better and sustainable jobs that pay high wages, mostly in Kern County. Ag doesn't do as many good jobs for us, so I'm interested in your perspective on those two movements and how we heal sooner than later to move forward and maybe give us some theories of what you see in other parts of the state.
I don't know if you all noticed what happened there when Dylan said, I'm going to ask a difficult question. Manuel handed me the microphone. Yeah, so obviously there's no simple answer to that question, other than it takes time and relationship building and conversations and really recognizing the common interests that are there. And I think it, requires a lot of reflexivity, for more of an academic term, of self-reflection. And I'll just share a little bit, as a white person in this country, it's been really important for me to learn about and understand the history of slavery, enslavement of people, the genocide. My ancestors came to this country as settlers, right? And I have inherited all that's come from it. And I think it's important for the labor movement to understand that there's a sector of that movement, of our movement, that has been very exclusionary. And excluding people of color, and the building trades have been part of that. And there's part of that that is, rooted in a large sector of the economy, large firms, and less organized in the retail sector or restaurants or service sector, and the whole move from a manufacturing economy to a service economy has meant part of the labor movement just missed that whole shift. There's another part of the labor movement, of course, that started from organizing in immigrant communities. Right? I'm thinking about the Justice for Janitors movement in LA, and of course, UFW and organizing in the fields, and where that connection is like this. And the very same people that are organizing unions are also the ones that are fighting against the pollution in the fields and the pollution of the toxic industries, and so they're connected like that. So I think part of it is helping to recognize those common interests and centering different voices in those struggles. I'll just mention that in our Central Labor Council in Monterey Bay, Cesar Lara is the head of it, and he's always making this point of we are organizing working people, right? And working people spend some of their time in the workplace, and they're also spending some of the time in their communities and neighborhoods and all the issues that are part of that. And there are community organizations in those places. And as a labor movement, we're just focusing on the workplace, we're blinding ourselves to that broader reality. So how do we help recognize that as a social movement and recognize that labor unions, what you're trying to do with this Empowerment Institute, I think, are not stopping at the boundaries of the workplace in terms of recognizing the importance of community and connection for working people and working families. But I'm sure Manuel will have lots of more interesting things to say because now he's had time to think about it.
I should just say, good question. So that's a great question to which there's no easy answer. So let me offer a couple things, 3 things that I think are actually kind of important. And the first I would say is to understand culture and to understand class as culture. And the reason why I say that, I've often been struck as someone who's been in an ethnic studies program, etc., that we often think about ethnicity as culture, but we forget about class as culture. So I grew up in La Puente, which is east of East LA, working class Latino. And certainly my Latino had something to do with who I am, but I grew up working class. And there have been 3 values to me. The importance of work, you're supposed to show up and work. The importance of craft, that whatever you did, you were supposed to be good at. My dad was a janitor, then repaired industrial air conditioners. He was very good at it. I tried to be a good professor, but I think sometimes people think craft is only in the academy. If you're a great janitor, I'm always struck when people say that agricultural work is unskilled. You ever done it? That is skilled work, right? Or you were talking about child care or elder care. So craft. And then the final value, which I identify as a working class value, is solidarity, that you're supposed to show up. One of my proudest moments growing up as a kid was that, started in a bad way. My dad had an industrial accident and lost 3/4 of a lung. He was sidelined for several months. And then when it came time for him to go back to work, this was repairing industrial air conditioners for the General Telephone Company, because he schooled in telephone equipment. When it came time to go back to work, his union was on strike. And they were trying to get my dad to come back to work. And we've been kind of suffering economically for some time. And my dad went straight to the picket line instead. And we were a little bit hungry, but we were a whole lot proud about that solidarity and what that meant. And I say that because being an oil worker in Kern County is a cultural phenomenon and not just money. Unless we think about the craft that's involved, the pride that's involved, and the conversation that needs to be there about that, so that then you can also have a conversation about EJ, which is its own culture too. What's the culture of growing up in communities that have been poisoned? And needing to band together to resist that poisoning and to challenge it. So I think that's an important set of conversations. And I get to the second point about how do you have transformational conversations rather than transactional conversations? How do we pay you off for losing your oil job? I mean, people want income, but they also, and again, the way I grew up work-wise was in construction as a house painter, which meant we covered up all the mistakes everybody else made. If you've been a painter, you know that. So I think, how do we have transformational conversations? And then finally, how do we understand the parameters of principled conflict? Where are we going to disagree? EJ's going to fight you on oil. That's its job. Unions are going to represent their workers. That's their job. But then how do we band together for more solar, more wind? And do we that in ways that are both distributed and large solar farms that are more easy to unionize and train people for? So how do we not let the difficult conversations get in the way of the bigger picture? It's not easy, but I think it starts in far more of a cultural place and a conversational place than just a transactional place. Turn over.
Yeah, just to the point of it's not about workforce development. I really like the point of it's about work systems development. Because in this case, I've always worked as an organizer, even with the Lotus Web Garden and radio, and done everything to be with the committee on the feet with the community. And when this issue comes up about, being part of a syndicato union, right? And being part of just a good employer, with a good employer, or just having a job period. I think that it's so important that the systems, even within, like the syndicato, they just offer certain things, but it doesn't rail in a way a system that within the syndicato or not in the syndicato, that you're going to grow as a person too and develop into those leadership roles, or maybe to that management level. I think that the systems, even if we develop jobs for like the farm workers, right, for them to be able to become the drone operators. Well, we have those organizations, but unfortunately, in my 30 years in the Valley, my perspective has been that once those organizations they receive those funds to develop those workers, like they're just pushing numbers out, and there's no quality, there's no craftsmanship, there's no appreciation, and no recognition and validation of those workers. I think that that's what's really lacking in. And solidarity, I think that right now, my son's 30 years old, and he's telling me all the time, man, Mom, you've always been out there in the community, how come you never did anything about the housing crisis? I was like, well, they hit me over the head. They hit me over the head in 2008 when they knew that the largest market of people who were going to buy homes in the Central Valley in California was going to be people who were first-time homeowners, who were low-income or fixed-income wagers, or they were community members who were migrant. So they knew that they were going to have all this government support, and they sold us the worst loans. They gave us the worst companies out here. They permitted the worst companies to come out here and be wolves on us. Solar industry, I did a project in partner with the Dolores Huerta Foundation to save families from the case loads. They came with solar projects that were government promoted and community environmental justice. I'm an environmental justice junkie. But, you know, the first thing I said is like, why is all this happening? Because nobody was regulating this industry. Because they just went out there and said, everybody, let's go green, do this. But they knew that for a farm worker in part here, he didn't need a solar panel because he already paying the low because it's on care, right? And he has a low income home and he's making low wages. For them to get a solar panel was like to buy a pool and pay droplets to put water in the pool. So it didn't make, there was no system to inform or empower really, not even the city governments. All of our city governments, our small city governments, the people there, I'm so happy they look like us. But that's, guess what I have to realize when they look like us? They lack the solidarity and knowledge and education and wealth management. So they're always going to be empowered by the legal system, which are the lawyers or the people who are going to manage. That's what I have to say.
In our round as well. Well, this has been really rich. We're actually going to move to panel right now, and then I know a couple of other people have questions. You'll be able to ask that of the panel. I know somebody in the audience just raised your hand. I know that no matter what happens, you will make sure that that question gets asked. So let me turn things over to them.
I am Ingrid Rostrom. I'm the Program Director for Climate Sustainability and Jobs at the UC Merced Community and Labor Center. So I will be facilitating some questions for our panelists. And the first one is about race. And how does racism fundamentally shape worker struggles? And how can we better address racism and advance more inclusive labor movements? And I will open this up for anyone who wants to, or we can ask them if people feel compelled that this is a question they want to answer.
Sure, yeah. So I think a lot about this, and I think this is the right room to say this and without getting in trouble, and I usually get in trouble when I say this. The labor movement and all of the movements in the Valley, all of the movements in the U.S. That we talk about. Sorry, I'm used to. Do you even need it? I can just. Yeah, sure. Anyway, I think about this a lot, and it always gets me in trouble outside of rooms like this. But we need to be talking about breaking white power, and I don't mean destroying white people, right? What I mean by that is breaking up rich white power. If we were in a different country where race wasn't an issue, we could just be talking about breaking up rich. But here, wealth is consolidated primarily by white people. So we need to be talking about doing that all the time. We need to find ways to activate young people, bring in hope. And I really appreciated the section of the book where you talk about this, the lack of investment in education in communities of color correlates directly to a lack of personal investment in education. They just don't believe in it. And we see that here. And so 70% of my students are Hispanic, and 90% of my students are students of color. And they're here because they're trying to figure out what the hell to do with themselves. They're not here because they have any faith in the future, any faith in education. And so we need to constantly ground ourselves in the idea, and in these statistics are very useful, that y'all are the majority now. You're coming into a majority. What are you going to do with it? How do we empower that? How do we activate these young people so that we can break and change and diversify power in ways that we haven't had an opportunity to do before?
You know, one of the things that I would add to that is the importance for white people of recognizing not just white privilege, but the way that racism hurts white people also. Right? Enforced racial division as a response to Bacon's Rebellion, right? It was an effort of, indentured laborers, many of them were white, coming together with descendants of people who've been brought from Africa to fight against the elites of the colony. And that was a threat. And so then the elites of the colony then reinforced those racial divisions and gave white working class people some of the, little privileges of that race to then divide the broader movement, right? And we're living through the legacy of that today, where so many of us who are white are blinded to the ways that racism in our country prevents us from having universal health care, from having guaranteed housing, from having labor protections in our workplace, all those things, because if you look back at those struggles, it was the racial divisions that undermined the political movements to create that. So that's just part of what I would add to
I think it's a great question, the significance of race and racism, how do we build stronger labor movements. I think in the book, you use the term racial capitalism a couple times. So that word comes from the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, where labor leaders were saying, it doesn't matter if you get rid of apartheid, this system is going to reproduce itself unless you do something about capitalism and class issues, right? I think there's lessons to be learned from that, and in some of the literature, the term racial capitalism was popularized by Cedric Robinson in Black Marxism, and he actually makes the argument that our understanding of Marxism, right? Marx predicted a revolution, that white workers, factory workers in Europe were gonna, overthrow the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production, and he was wrong. And Cedric Robinson shows how it was the global South, agricultural workers, people of color, that were waging anti-colonist campaigns. That's where the labor movement had its greatest thrust. The Civil War, that was in many ways a general strike. Black people refusing to be slaves. And I think we get into problems, when we don't take that long perspective, because Robinson tells us that Marx was middle class. He was writing to philosophers, academics that were concerned with the Enlightenment and middle class people, having their piece of the pie. And he completely didn't pay attention to issues of race. And what Robinson tells us is that, the best literature among, radical Black thinkers was not because they had degrees. It was because they were in conversation with the really leftist labor movement. And so the perspective that Robinson has is that academics should not be in conversation with each other. We should be in conversation with the labor movement, right? This is where the ideas are being generated. And so, instead of, this trope of enlightenment and equity or equality, Robinson is talking about liberation. Those furthest on the margins. During the Civil War, people were not calculating the mean and the median earnings of Black people and saying we need to close this gap and make things equitable. They were saying we need to free those that are furthest on the margins. And so that's the spirit of the most progressive work that the labor movement can do. And so I would say, this is where we need to push things is, as academics, we shouldn't be in conversation with each other, we should be in conversation with the labor movement.
I'll be super quick because I already spoke when you heard Chambers others' questions. But the only thing I want to say is if you do something more, you get better at it. And the reason I mention that is because these conversations about race, which ought to really be conversations about racism, because race is like, where'd you come from, how'd you grow up? Racism is about structural disadvantage. And that for the labor movement to be able to build better bridges with the EJ movement, constant conversations about racism and structural inequality are key, so that people develop more language, more familiarity, and more willingness to hear difficult things and go, oh, that's a good point.
So the next question is how do recent initiatives in California, including SURF, or California Jobs First, as it's now called, how does that have implications for solidarity economics or vice versa? And what do you see as current opportunities to reimagine economic and workforce development in a way that centers workers and disadvantaged residents?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. So for people who don't know, California Jobs First is a state initiative. It's been around for about 3 years. Used to be called the California Economic Recovery Resilience Fund. Forget which one. Community. Yes, Charlie. California Jobs First is worse. But you know, it was a pot of money that was really designed to help communities coming out of the pandemic, that had written into the legislation some, you know, great sounding things about a commitment to equity, about commitment to good jobs, about targeting resources in places most in need. And to access these funds, it required regions around the state to come together with different constituencies, you know, labor movement, environmental justice organizations, community organizations, together with the public sector and business leaders, to then put together proposals for state funding. And, you know, I forget the exact amount, $650 million or something on that scale. Which sounds like a lot of money, but in the context of the, you know, the California economy, is not transformative by any means. But important. So that process is very uneven around the state in terms of the political interests that are represented in those coalitions. You know, I'd say in some parts of the states, you know, labor has been a real leader and, you know, equitable partner in that. In other parts of the state, labor has been completely excluded. And so without going into the details of each different one, you know, part of the lesson that comes out of that is, you know, policy is one thing. People often joke that implementation is where good policy goes to die. And that's the danger, right? Like, we've got to be paying attention to those power relationships on the ground, how they operate, and figure out, you know, how do we leverage those opportunities that come and go, right, around electoral cycles, and, you know, whose political interests are represented around any particular policy. Like, how do we leverage that to support what we need, which is actually the longer term power building work going on in our communities, bringing labor and community together with that long-term perspective.
Yeah, so about the Community Economic Resilience Fund, California Jobs First. I think the forerunner to that was Regions Rising. And, you know, we became concerned when we saw here in Fresno that Fresno Drive was taking off and we didn't see labor at the table. And, you know, there's all this great communications about how this is centering community. But the people that are the real experts on work, you know, they weren't part of the design phase. And so, you know, this really scared us. And I think, you know, looking at the trajectory of Regions Rise, SURF, California Jobs First, there are very powerful white people that they've been in power for a long time. Before they weren't talking about race. Now, all of a sudden, they're talking to us about race. And I think there's a danger in that, because talk is cheap. What matters is who are you in relationship with. And if you're just talking about race, you know, to signal something about yourself so you can keep getting all that public money, and you've never worked with, you've never actually had a successful campaign where you lift standards for workers, that's a red flag. And I think, you know, this is where we get into the limits of academic texts. We can talk to you about theories and ideas and what, you know, like, I think in the abstract it sounds good, but in the real world, industry is very well organized. And I think, you know, maybe this is, you know, like, if I could pick it at something small in the book, I would say, you know, the book sets up this dichotomy of traditional economic theory, individuality, self-interest, and on the other side, mutuality, social movement, solidarity economics. But the truth is, industry is very well organized. And so, the question is like, it's about strategy, it's about organizing. Because when you hear powerful white people that have never talked about race, and all of a sudden they are saying that they are going to be leading on these initiatives, you have to ask, who's at the table, who's involved? Why does it look that way? Can we change that? One other thing, universal basic income. We see who's at the table for universal basic income. It's not the people that have been fighting for workers and trying to raise standards. And then we've done research to advance an initiative called Safety Net for All in California to create wage replacement for undocumented workers, because people who fear losing their jobs are afraid to organize, and for that reason, there's got to be something to support them so that they don't have to be afraid about, going up against their employer. And so the safety net movement has had so many amazing leaders that are like coming from the immigrant rights movement, the worker movement. And so, universal basic income in theory might sound good. The safety net stuff maybe sounds like it could be problematic, but on the ground, it's a different reality. And so we need to think about who we're in relationship with and the work that we do, who is that in service of.
So one thing I'll add to this, because I think Ed and Ingrid would probably feel awkward adding in, is that there's another part of infrastructure which is really important, and that's the fact that there's been this expansion of labor centers around the state. That the anchors for that were Berkeley and LA, UC Merced has really taken off, and now there's labor centers at every UC. And that on Friday, the governor's May revision is threatening to take away the money for the labor centers. And it is important that there be these hybrids, whether academic, community, labor, conversation spaces for these issues to get raised in a very important way. So, one of the things that I've thought that was interesting about sort of California jobs first is creating tables that could then steer the dollars that are eventually going to come from infrastructure money and IRA. So the $650 million is really small compared to what's going to come afterwards and what tables will be in place. You could disagree about whether that's important or not. But what allows people to have voice is a strong infrastructure, strong labor movement, strong EJ movement, strong community organizing, and labor centers are really a key part of that. So I think one thing for people to be paying attention to as people debate what's going to happen with the budget going forward is to make sure that this key infrastructure element does not get eliminated. And I know you guys can't say that, or it sounds like it's self-serving. I'm at like a private university, so.
It's a nice segue, talking about the shift we've seen in the last year from big surpluses, lots of federal, state programs for climate, Inflation Reduction Act funding, to yesterday's they revised, where we're seeing cuts to very important programs. So how do we advance mutuality and address poverty, unemployment, income inequalities without significant government investment and with significant pullbacks of those public dollars?
So I'll be quick because I just said something. So first, it is true that the state of California currently looks like it's experiencing economic, really fiscal difficulties. But those IRA dollars are going to continue to flow, Inflation Reduction Act dollars, because those dollars are actually based on subsidies to business for making investments, it's gonna be a lot more money than was budgeted. Because it turns out that part of the economy, of our economy, is growing rapidly, so there's gonna be a lot more money. And I think the big trap in this moment is to get locked into an austerity perspective, that this austerity is inevitable. There's gonna be federal resources, but more than that, we don't really know what the California state budget's gonna look like in a year. Because the stock market has actually done well, and we're very reliant on the income of rich people in the state. And we shouldn't give up the idea that we should be dealing with revenue streams as well. And I think it is an opportune moment actually to resurrect Prop 15, which was seeking to shift the property tax structure. So I think the thing I worry about is all of us getting locked into an austerity mindset when there's actually a fair amount, I don't want to overstep, I think there's a fair amount of resources to come from the feds, and it gets us not thinking about the revenue side of the equation.
So how do we advance mutuality? I think there's a lot of lessons. You know, we're in the San Joaquin Valley. This is where the farm worker movement began in the 60s and 70s that created all these innovations that revitalized the American labor movement through, as the speakers mentioned earlier, you know, justice for janitors, and how that led to other campaigns like Stand for Security, how that folded into the living wage movement, and then Up for 15, which the book mentions as well. And I think organizing and strategy, you know, that's really the how that gets us from great ideas, you know, to materializing things, right? Strategy is not, Marshall Gant says strategy is not, it's not a verb, it's an action. Or it's not a thing, right? It's a verb. To strategize is to do. And so if we're thinking about how to build mutuality, you know, I gotta say, this is the most Latino region in the state. 7 out of 8 counties are majority Latino. Outside of this region, only 3 counties in California are Latino. You know, we have to think about the significance of the farm worker movement, the demographics, what this region means to Mexican Americans here in the state and beyond. So the fact that like there's this rich history, that there's a very distinct demographic profile, and we have to think about who we're in relationship with. So it doesn't matter if the austerity cuts come. We have to think about building power and who we're in relationship with. If the powers that be dangle some money and say, you know, you've got to come over here because this is where the opportunities are, think about who they're in relationship with. Because, you know, even with us, like, you know, the state threatening budget cuts, we're not worried. Why? Because the work that we do has value because of the relationships that we have. The money was something that just kind of came afterwards. The relationships is what builds everything. And if you stay true to those relationships, you can build a movement. The moment that you go chase the money and you forget about the relationships that you have, that's when everything goes south.
I think I was just going to say that a lot less eloquently and a lot more concisely. And so I appreciate the framing of saying this instead of the economy, say our economy, but I would also just like to remind people that money and economies are constructs and imaginary. People are real and relationships are real, and that's what we need to work on and continue with. And one of the things that I see here in the Fresno area, and this is true of any large metropolitan area, is you have pockets of people that don't visit one another, right? So the Fresno County area. And if you look at the environmental and social determinants of health in the valley, one of the most appalling figures, I'm preaching to the choir, but one of the most appalling figures is, so the life expectancy in 9705 versus the life expectancy in whatever the fuck northeast of Fresno is. I can't remember. 9710? Okay, so, no, I don't live there, yeah. So, 64, 89. 25-year difference based on air quality, based on water quality, based on availability of good food, all of those things. And so when we talk about the state cutting funds, we should be worried about that, right? But as a pickup to the answer to the last question, we should also be worried about white saviors with money bags. Because it's just like NGOs abroad, right? 95% of that money goes to their salaries. And then they can walk around and go, see, we did something good with that remaining 5%. When what we really need to do is get these people over here who are outliving these people by a full generation to see them, to feel them, to talk to them, to get into a relationship with them, and then bring them to the tables that only they've been allowed at historically.
So one thing I just want to add is thinking both about short-term and long-term struggles. And to just add to this is the structure of finance of local government. So, we're talking about state revenue, and I agree 100% we need to be talking about revenue generation, not just cutting, because there's opportunities there. We're not, by all signs, going into a recession at the moment. So local governments are in quite a different kind of structural position. But the way we finance our local government essentially is a South African apartheid-like structure. In the Monterey Bay, the city of Monterey, tourism-based industry, 95% of the workforce cannot live there or do not live there because it's so expensive. And yet they're contributing to an economy that's generating sales tax, that's generating hotel occupancy tax, and that's building a property base for the local government. The revenue per capita in Monterey is 6 times the revenue per capita of Salinas, which is 95% Latino. And guess what? Monterey is almost 95% white. So we need to be using this opportunity to be looking at our revenue systems to deal with those longer-term structural problems as well.
And this will be my final question, and hopefully to end on a positive note, which is just to open it up and provide, a success story, an example, something that, that moves you in your work towards solidarity economics. Success stories and examples.
So we're all lucky enough to, in the academic world, we're all lucky enough to work with young people. What I see with people under 30 is both very, very frustrating, but also very, very encouraging. They understand systems better than we did when we were their age. Like they get it intuitively. I don't know if it's because they grew up with computers or they grew up with the internet, whatever. They understand systemic institutional problems better than we did. Now, I know I'm supposed to hang on, but what also worries me is that they have almost no faith in institutions at all. And so that's one of the things that how many of you are under 30? 2, 3, 3. Thank you for being here. I don't know how to make this hit to people under 30, but I have so much great hope for all the work that you're going to do to sort of unfuck what everybody else has done. And I see that every day in my classrooms and every day in the organizing that we get to do. So I see young people coming into the labor movement, young people coming into social justice and EJ movements, and they get it in a way that they're not going to have to upskill like we did, and spend 15 years in this kind of figuring out what the contours of it are. That's
Yeah, there's so many things that inspire me that are all not talking to my colleagues in the academy, as much as I love talking to them sometimes. But the academy is not much of a sign of hope these days. But working with communities. And the one example I thought I'd share, I'm part of something called the Salinas Inclusive Economic Development Initiative, which is bringing together the Central Labor Council with a whole variety of other community organizations, including an arts education program in the Alisal School District, working with elementary kids around art. And some of that is murals and really helping young people. It's called Hijos del Sol, and part of what it does is help envision a future and a world that young people want to live on, and then represent that on walls and buildings all over the region. And for Hijos del Sol to start thinking about their work as workforce development, right? As helping young people see and imagine and create the future they want to live in. Like, if that ain't creating a better workforce of the future, I don't know what is, right? And so it's just transformative to be working with these young people around economic justice and seeing that as part of our economy.
When the question was first asked, I thought, can we find any examples of, but yeah, there are. So I'll give a few as quick as I can. The big one that I want to mention right now is United Farm Workers had a big march, I think it was a year and a half ago, up to the state capitol. Historic, only the third time in their history that they had a big march all the way up to the state capitol. They won the bill that they were fighting for to allow card check on farms and among farm workers. And so there's been a few farms that they've already managed to organize. One of them, the most recent one being Wonderful, which is kind of like the Walmart of the farm industry. So really incredible, props to them. And then a couple other ones that I think are worth mentioning as well. We were involved with, we did the Farm Worker Health Study, also with the UFW and a bunch of community organizations as well. The largest ever academic survey on the health and well-being of the nation's most disadvantaged workforce. And one of the policy recommendations was greater investment in of public subsidies in agricultural employers who are willing to try to live to industry standards, high road employees. And the USDA, met with us, met with some other folks as well, designed this initiative to give $65 million to growers that show that they're improving their standards. And they have criteria, different metrics for like different tiers. And one of the, for example, like having a neutrality agreement in place. And so that was a $65 million initiative. They've asked us to do the research on that, so that's going to be ongoing. We're going to learn a lot about the dynamics of what's happening on those farms that have gotten subsidies. And then the third thing that I'll mention in Kern County, and I mention this because Solidarity Economics, the end of page chapter 5, mentions Kern County in the setup to the chapter 6 on social movements, right? This is an important region in the state for so many things that are happening statewide. Years ago, we outcompete a venture capital group, for getting the high road training partnership there. And then when SURF came around, so we were asked to do the research behind it. Community and labor, it's really tough to bring people together, in that area. John Spalding, before he passed away, had building trades. He had committed to working with us through the Kern and Humano Central Labor Council. This was a just transition type of project, and the question is, how can, what the book is trying to get at, like how do we create this better future? Unfortunately, he passed away, during the work that we were doing. SURF happened, California Jobs First happened. They asked to contract with us to do the research for it. We published the report. Some people didn't like it because it didn't give them a pathway for some really questionable types of economic development. So it's very messy. Sometimes you have a win and it doesn't, it's nothing, you can really, in a concrete way, say this is what we want. But I think the work that we did working with community and labor, trying to forge those relationships, people trying to do things differently, and us ultimately publishing a report that, is honest and maybe didn't give, a path to the low road. I think all of those things are worth celebrating. So those are a few examples.
So I'll go national. The UAW. So think about the strategic brilliance of striking all three companies rather than just one, to staging the strikes with a sophisticated understanding of the supply chain so that you could just kind of kill off an entire industry by taking out one plant. Coupled with an argument that the wealth of these companies had been generated by the workers and by public policy, by the support and sacrifice during the financial crash, and by the public will to move to an EV new platform. And the key demand of the UAW, which was to stop a two-tier system that divides workers from one another and both reinforces racial inequality because who came in late and who had the incumbent positions, although not, not only by aspects of race, but really looked at what's going to divide our movement is this in people who've already got it, who've got good wages, not paying attention to people coming up after them, and then successfully concluding that strike with not only a victory, but with a strategy to organize the South, and then achieving the first victory there just a week or two ago. That's solidarity economics in practice and at scale. And we've got examples that run from that to local community land trusts, etc. So I think we see, of course, with the news, there's always reasons to be pessimistic. But I like to think of myself as someone who is optimistic, who can walk into a room full of manure and say, wow, who brought the pony in? And I think there's a lot of reasons to look at what's sprouting up with young folks, what's sprouting up with different systems of workforce development, what's sprouting up with the beautiful examples that Ed brought about here in the Central Valley and what's happening nationally as well.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to look to, thank you to our panelists.